management. I usually try to tailor the presentation to the specific group, so what I try to do is take some pieces that I shared a year ago and a lot of the new things that we're working on. Just to give you a little background, I'm Bloomington Public Schools Director of Community Relations, Family Engagement, and Emergency Management. I've been in schools for about 25 years in this position with 4 different school districts in Wisconsin, Colorado, and now Minnesota, and also with the State Department of Education in Madison, Wisconsin for a number of years. My work around working in schools has always been around community relations, communications, and emergency management. Back in 1996, working with a former law enforcement officer at the time in Wisconsin, we developed the first mock crisis involving an active shooter in a school because we had developed emergency plans and we were wanted somehow to test that emergency plan. In other words, to make sure that it was a responsive plan to the types of things we were seeing in workplace violent type of, back in the early and mid 90s, workplace violent acts where there were active shooters that eventually would hit our schools, and we all know that schools are a microcosm of our community, so we knew it was only a matter of time. So that was the nexus for it. Back in 1998, I moved out to Colorado to work in Colorado's largest public school system with 85,000 students, covered 790 square miles. Our school bus transportation did a circumference of the earth every day, transporting kids in our district of 150 school sites. So you can imagine there was a behemoth of the school district. In 1999, April 1999, found myself at Columbine High School, where you all know that at that time was the worst school shooting, and I led the crisis response team to that shooting and have since become a national expert on school crises and have worked with all school districts since then that have gone through an active shooter incident, including the most recent Marysville-Pilchuck High School, providing them resources and guidance and counseling in terms of that. So I have a broad experience in emergency management, not only in schools, but colleges and universities, working with federal agencies as well as the emergency management agencies in many of our states, and then did a 40-day stint down in New Orleans helping FEMA out during Hurricane Katrina and Rita. So that gives you a little background on myself. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit about crisis management leadership, and I hope you were able to walk away with a couple nuggets to help you understand what we do in schools to be prepared and then how we respond to a crisis, and certainly then the recovery aspects to that. And then building enough time, hopefully, for any questions and answers and be done and get out of here. I think a little after 12 o'clock is I think the time that we have. When we talk about crisis management, and really when all of us working in school districts, we have a responsibility and a role with respect to crisis management. And it's are we ready? And when we talk about are we ready, is in a crisis situation, we react as we are organized and trained. In the last 15 years, we have changed significantly protocols of how we respond to school crises, not the Columbine and the Marysville-Pilchuck type of incidents, but everything in between. I remember when I started working with schools about 15 years ago, shortly after the Columbine attack, we would ask a room full of educators and school staff, how many have a crisis plan? And less than 50% of the people would raise their hand. Now I can go in a room and ask, how many do you have a crisis plan? It's 100%. The more importantly is, how often is that crisis plan taken off the shelf, and how often is it reviewed and updated? Because we learn after every time these incidents occur, or any other type of crisis that we deal with. Probably more so, in fact, if you look at it, we probably have more school bus transportation incidents that we deal with on a fairly regular basis than we will ever, most school districts will ever deal with in terms of a Columbine. So when we talk about being organized and trained, it's the kinds of workshops like you're attending today and the drills that we do not only in our schools, but through our school bus transportation departments and others to be prepared for the types of crises you will deal with. And I will tell you that there's not a crisis out there that we haven't figured out or know about, but each one brings a unique set of circumstances. So knowing what to do can be the difference between chaos and calm, and sometimes even life and death. When I arrived on the scene at Columbine High School, within minutes after the shots were fired, I was a former paramedic studying, I was an EMS studying to be a paramedic. I had nearly finished up all of my clinicals to be a paramedic. before I got into school public relations and communications. So when I arrived on scene, I didn't wear the communications hat. It was providing triage and emergency first aid to a number of victims. And as you all know, the two individuals murdered 12 students, one teacher, and wounded about 24 other students and staff. Several very severely and critical, and had lifelong injuries as a result of that. So knowing what to do between the difference between chaos and calm, life and death. And the best safety policies are only as effective as the people who implement them. That's why we talk about drills, that's why we talk about training, to help us be better prepared to respond to any type of crisis, regardless of what that is. So then it comes down to leadership, knowing what to do. It's more about who you are than what you know. Because we probably could spend a great deal of time listing all the types of incidents that have occurred, not only in schools, but in organizations and companies across this country and across the world, where they have been major mistakes and have probably added to an initial crisis. In fact, most crises, you have the initial crisis, but then there's a secondary and often tertiary crisis within a crisis. Our job as leaders is not to create a crisis within a crisis. No learned leadership skill then will overcome a lack of character, ethics, and integrity. School districts as public institutions were very transparent. So when we have incidents, our job is to make sure that we're responding to it, but also we have stakeholders, parents, students, staff, our community at large we are under the microscope in those kinds of incidents. How we respond, how we react, determines how our community and how others will perceive us. So an effective leader is one that acts deliberately, quickly, and effectively with honesty, high moral values, and ethical standards. Before I moved to Minnesota, I was consulting with a number of school districts. In one of the school districts, I was called to assist, had an incident where, and I hope if you are from the school district, I'm not going to identify your school district, but I hope you will recognize it. This was quite a few years ago, but they had a bomb threat, a pretty severe bomb threat at the high school. And the administration or the leadership at the time decided to evacuate students and then ultimately send them home for the day. But the communication that went home to parents is that it was a water main break. Now, what do you have when you have a water main break? You usually have water. Well, there was no water in and around the school as students and others were let go that day, and as parents would drive and pick up the kids, there was no water. What it turned out is the high school, the administration of the school district was concerned about the image that it would portray if they were to reveal really what happened. What that was, they had an initial crisis. The bomb threat obviously didn't come to fruition, as most bomb threats don't, but they created a crisis within that little issue, that little incident that occurred on that day. As a result, I was called in and the superintendent asked me if I could fix the problem. And once I got through her explaining what the problem was, I said, there's nothing I can do. The problem is you've already created. The job now is to apologize, admit you were wrong, and what are you going to do about it? And that led to a significant training. We have the human capacity to forgive and forget. Forgiveness is when we admit that we screwed up and we make a mistake. And this is what we're going to do about it. So when we talk about these realities, it's about being truthful and honest, transparent. Prompt action reduces collateral damage. Prompt action reduces the length of the crisis and moves the situation to a quicker resolution. Now, some crises by their nature just demands and dictates how long an incident carries on. Columbine, for whatever reason, became one of these seminal events in U.S. history. It wasn't the first school shooting, by far from it. It was one of the worst ones, but it became a 24-hour news cycle for a very long period of time. And then there were a number of blunders that occurred as part of that, and it was a wake-up call not only to schools, but also law enforcement that changed significantly our responses to violent offenders in our schools and other ways to respond to these types of incidents. So our job as we prepare for any type of emergency or incident is to focus on the response, not the sources of threat. We could spend a lot of time identifying all the types of things that could happen in our world, in our organization, man-made and natural disasters and acts of God. That if we spend all our time doing that, we are missing the responsibility we have to know what to do when bad stuff happens. Now, we in the emergency management field have been working constantly throughout the years to try to stay one step ahead of the bad guys. And we learn something new each time. For example, we're seeing more and more schools that are going with access management systems where they're creating barriers to slow down these active shooters, these perpetrators. Well, Adam Lanza at Sandy Hook Elementary School, and by the way, what we know about active shooters, they know the location that they're going to. They typically have been there, and they typically, in some cases, have been students, or they're very familiar with the location, even workplace violence. They know the site, they know the navigating around, and their targets are typically targets of opportunity. The most recent one in Seattle area was not. Those were not targets of opportunity. In other words, that individual targeted those, his classmates and two of his cousins. But what we're saying here is that at Sandy Hook, we knew that Adam Lanza knew that the front doors were locked when school day started. He couldn't enter the school because it was completely locked up. So what did he do? He shot his way through a glass panel, not the main door, but the glass panel, and walked through to get into the main foyer of the school, where he encountered his two victims, the school psychologist, the principal, who were responding to the glass breaking and things like that. So more and more schools are putting on that 3-on film or other, I wouldn't say bullet prevention glass because it's almost astronomically too expensive, but glass that does not shatter with 1 or 2 bullets being shot through it. It shatters much like a car window, but won't break apart, as we saw out at Sandy Hook Elementary School. So focus on the response, not the sources of threat. It's not possible to conceive every possible crisis. One of the disclaimers I should share with you, there's a lot of information on these slides, and I don't cover all of them specifically. If you want this presentation or the information, I'll be happy to share it with Fred, and he can get it out to the membership as well. Okay. The other thing I should share with you, I'm part Italian. My mother was a first-generation Italian in the Chicago area, so you know, all Italians, we speak fast and use our hands. So I will fly through a lot of this. So if you have a question or you want me to clarify something, just raise your hand and go ahead and ask. Decisions need to be based on the size of the location and the unique set of circumstances that comes with every type of crisis. So when you think about school bus types of incidents that you deal with, every decision that we make is based on that side of that location. We had a couple weeks ago a young boy, I think a first grader, that was being dropped off with his siblings on the right side of the road. His house happened to be on the right side of the road, so he would be in no danger. But for whatever reason, his older brother crossed a street, a 4-lane street, and he chased after him and was hit by a vehicle. Bus driver saw it unfold, nothing the bus driver could do, but he was able to dial 911. He immediately kept the other students on the bus safe and stayed there to relay information to make sure that first responders knew what to do. We were then contacted to go in and assist and provide some assistance to the family once the young boy was transported to the hospital. Now we know the next type of incident that might be similar to that is going to have a unique set of circumstances related to that as well. And we work with our transportation department here throughout all of these types of incidents, and we always do what we call a hot wash. What did we learn? What would we do differently? Okay, whether they do it internally or whether they do it by bringing me or another emergency management person in to assist with that. Now, I'm often asked when I work with school districts, and actually this is the cardiac assessment terminology, a lot of people would ask me, how did you know what to do when you were at Columbine High School? Arriving on scene and having all of these victims shot multiple times outside the school, we were trying to get people rescued, get them in ambulances, and actually the first victims that we were able to transport were transporting vehicles because ambulance had not yet arrived. So I coined a terminology called cardiac assessment. It is the knowledge, experience, skills one attains, and you have these as well in your training and your work, but also intuition. We have an incredible innate ability to use our heart and our mind. So what is right in the heart and mind to make decisions? Now, I will be the first to tell you, did we make every decision the best decision possible throughout the response? Hell no. We made mistakes and we learned from those mistakes. Mistakes are just, and taking risks are just an opportunity to learn. And now, we try not to make mistakes, just the nature of the business when you're dealing with crises. Cardiac assessment, knowing the right thing to do through the heart and mind. Intuition, skills, knowledge, experience. It's always about tending to victims' needs first, foremost, and completely. I told you about the young boy that was hit by a car. That was not anything that we did that put that child in harm's way. The choice he made, and thankfully he survived some significant injuries. He's at home recovering. But what did we do? We immediately sent a team of people to the hospital to connect with the family. Also, we wanted to be able to relay information back to the driver. Let the driver know that she did not do anything that put this child in harm's way. So tending to victims' needs immediately, compassionately, and completely. Be prepared, folks. Bad stuff happens. Sometimes completely out of your control. Okay? By the way, this picture up in the upper right-hand corner is one of our triage sites at Columbine High School. Students were fleeing in the neighborhood just to get away from the school. We were able to get a couple triage sites set up where a fair distance away from the school where we could render at least initial first aid, assess victims, and then get them packaged and loaded once the ambulances or vehicles came and we could get them to the hospital. All of the victims that were able to make it out of the school survived by the grace of God and by the incredible care provided not only by first responders but by hospitals. All of the victims survived. Those that were killed almost instantly or within a short period of time. The only one was the teacher, Dave Sanders, who suffered significant injuries when he went to run out of the cafeteria upstairs to the library to warn kids to get out when he encountered the two murderers, was shot multiple times. He succumbed to his injuries several hours later because at that time, protocol was we needed to secure, the law enforcement needed to secure the building and make entry to various different points to neutralize the threat before they got victims out of the school and survivors as that. So it's all about ensuring students and staff safety. The thing that I want to point out here is this piece about focus on response versus the sources of the crisis. Because sometimes, as I said, we get too caught up in these sources of the crisis and not specifically on the response and how we do that. A couple of the critical things here is develop steps to return to normal, even though anytime there's an incident, there's a new set of normalcy. And when we talk about returning to normal, it's taking care of our own as well. Not only the victims, but those that have survived or lived through it. Those that have been involved in accidents, those that have been involved in the incident occurred on the bus. Because sometimes we don't know how the person may come across and say, things are fine, I'm okay. But post-traumatic stress disorder knows no time limit and knows no type of degree of how serious it can become. The principal of Columbine High School, who's a very good friend of mine, it took a number of years before he realized that post-traumatic stress disorder had kicked in. He had lost his wife and was really just going further and further downhill. He retired this past year after 17 years, after 30-some years in education, 17 of which were the principal of Columbine High School. But if he would have never survived if he didn't deal with the kinds of issues that came with post-traumatic stress disorder. The other critical piece is here. And this is one of the things that I work with school districts and colleges and universities in our own district a lot on, and that is creating this cultural condition that practice is important. That's the drills. That's the workshops that we go through and making sure that people understand what to do in an emergency. And not overloading their brain with 4, 5, 6 things to do, but 1, 2, maybe 3 things to do, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. So outline the steps to practice and rehearse and do it over and over and over again. Creates the cultural condition that practice is important and develops the teamwork needed during a crisis because it is not a one-person response. It takes a team of individuals to do the kinds of things that we need to do. At Columbine, I had a team of 5 other school community relations, emergency management professionals on my staff. We called in help from across the country because this crisis took a life of its own and ran for a very long period of time. It wasn't until May 2nd or 3rd that the tornadoes that hit Norman, Oklahoma and wiped out the big portion of that community that national media moved out after being in 24 hours news cycles for about a 2.5, 3 week period. But we had dealt with those kinds of issues for about a year and a half. So it doesn't go away, okay? The other thing here includes faculty, staff, students, and planning and training. Absolutely critical. People know what to do. These are the four primary areas that the U.S. Department of Education, U.S. Department of Homeland Security have identified as key elements to crisis management, prevention and intervention. Those are the steps to reduce or eliminate the risk to life or property. These are the things we have in place to identify either students or staff that may be struggling. Students, by and large, some people call them student threat assessment team or student assessment teams, identify students that might be falling through the crack or become disenfranchised, disengaged. What resources can we provide to the school district, or in some cases, external resources to deal with those issues that those students are having? One thing we know about all of the active shooters, while you cannot profile an active shooter, what we do know, the tendencies are that all of the active shooters have told someone about their plans. Someone they either have confided in or they've shared off the cuff. They have a website that others are aware of. It's called leakage. But what we know is in 90% of these cases, no one has come forth with that information to let others know. So when we know, when we are able to respond, we can provide the resources needed to help students. That's why you don't, the stories that often don't make it are those averted incidents, because of either very good police work or the ability of someone coming forward, stepping in, sharing with us, or sharing with law enforcement to get the resources to avert these kinds of tragedies. Preparedness is the process of planning a rapid, coordinated, and effective response. That includes not just the school district types of incidents, but transportation as well. I've been working with our transportation department over the last couple of years to identify protocols and procedures around responding to incidents on the bus, off the bus, in the area, and then what do bus drivers do when our schools are in lockdown or emergency condition? And what do we expect our drivers to do in assistance to us to evacuate students in those types of situations as well? Then the response is the action steps. What are those specific protocols? And finally, the recovery. The piece that I believe school districts need to do a far better job of in response to, because oftentimes when a crisis is over with, we have this aha moment that says we can now breathe, the crisis is over, we can now move on. But in reality, recovery also knows no time limit. And so recovery is checking in with folks, because there are triggering events that occur that re-victimize and re-traumatize individuals that have been through a tragedy. Think of a time in your life, if you've dealt with a personal crisis, something that triggers that memory each and every time and how you think and feel about that. So recovery is an ongoing process. And what we do in school districts too much is we kind of forget and move on. We have to take care of our own. We have to remember that when we've been through these kinds of incidents, it takes a long time to recover and heal from that. Okay, so key questions we need to ask ourselves if you have an incident. What can or will we be able to handle? What are the roles that we will do ourselves? We'll delegate to volunteers or others. Where do we get that help? And who will do what? And how we address that, other questions, how we address that is through what we call a crisis management infrastructure. Now, law enforcement and fire responders have what's called the Incident Command System, ICS. It was developed back in the 70s when the forest fires out in California had multiple agencies responding, and there was not a collaborative communication ability to respond in a manner that people knew what the right hand was doing, the left hand, this agency and this agency. And so it came on to that was an incident command system, which really establishes a common organizational structure and operating procedures for multiple responding agencies or collaborative agencies. So in a school district, when you have an incident, law enforcement is going to be most likely the first response to that, and then in some cases, an ambulance service, or in some cases, fire. And so understanding the language and who's doing what is critical to the response being managed in such a way that we're not stepping on the toes of law enforcement, and vice versa when it's no longer a crime scene and school district takes over. It establishes one person in charge. For school districts, initially the incident, there's an incident commander, is most likely a principal or his or her designee, if he or she is out of the office on that particular day. And there's a structure here I will show you, because you have to have someone in charge initially. If it's a criminal act, when law enforcement arrives, they now take charge. We hand over that to an incident commander, whoever that is, in law enforcement. If it's a fire, the fire chief or fire department assistant chief or someone takes over command. So one person is in charge of decision making, creates that chain of command. That takes away the guesswork that some people have of who's in charge, who's doing what. It provides for quick, effective performance and establishes that reasonable span of control. So in that infrastructure, you have incident command. You also have a communication command. Communication is critical to not only on-site, but internally and also externally with our parents and our stakeholders. Because I will guarantee you, if you do not have a communications piece in place to communicate to parents, you're going to have parents showing up that are going to put themselves in harm's way. It's going to make the work of law enforcement and or fire that much more difficult. And your organization will suffer greatly because one of your key stakeholders the perception will be you don't know what you're doing. Because we have not established the ability to not only communicate, but tell parents what to do, where to go to reunify with their child. Roles and responsibilities, and then as I talked about this parent reunification site, where parents need to go to reconnect with their children. Once we got them safely out of the school, they've been processed by law enforcement if they need to interview them, talk to them about what they saw, they heard, so on and so forth. Okay? This is what it looks like. Now, incident command, as I said, started in the late 70s. Only recently, within the last 5 or 6 years, have we developed a modification to that for schools. In fact, our principals, each of our schools has a building emergency response team, in addition to a district emergency response team. And all of the folks that are part of those teams, including principal and assistant principals that are leaders, have gone through training, incident command system training, and either have become certified through ICS or have taken the coursework to be, they just have to take the test to become certified. But this is what it looks like. And everybody has been identified in each of our schools that have this incident command system. Many school districts have implemented incident ICS and many have not. I would tell you that is probably the quickest way, easiest way to respond to any kind of emergency. Now, what you mean, you're looking at this and say, well, what's transportation's role in the logistics piece, because they play a significant support role. But if there were to be a transportation issue or an accident, the incident command team is typically going to be the transportation director, is the command-in-chief. He or she is then dictating the work of the team, and we go through training for that. Either that, or they would hand it off to the district emergency response team. Okay, because it often cases it's a district-wide issue. All right, in Bloomington and in many schools, your school districts, you have, we call them school-safe conditions. You have some kind of evacuation, you have lockdowns, you have shelters in place, things like that. Many school districts have different forms of a lockdown. Creates far more confusion. What we know about responding to a crisis, as I shared earlier, is your brain is on overload. It cannot process a whole lot of things. So when it comes to a school crisis, that's why our incident command system, our teams, go through significant training, constant drills. Remember I talked about provides that cultural condition to know what to do. So when we have an incident in our school, one of the first things the principal is going to do is to assess the situation, and within a very, very short period of time, talking seconds, not minutes, we'll put the school in a safe condition into one of these areas. And then calling 911 depending on the incident, whether it's inside or outside. The third thing we're doing is calling our office. So we can mobilize the district emergency response team if needed, or on a much smaller scale, we can provide resources to them, communication or assistance on site. Now, when it comes to our teaching staff and others, we don't ask them to do a whole lot other than know what to do, and you can't see it, but each of these protocols, the evacuation, lockdown, shelter in place, severe weather, hold in place, have a list of things what we want you to do. And while it may seem like I think there's 8, 11, or 12 under lockdown, really all it is you're closing the door, dropping your blinds, your door is already locked, so you don't have to worry about finding your keys and trying to lock the door. You close the door, move into a safe location within the room, you're quiet, you ask the kids to turn off the cell phones. If you can think of it, push tables, desks, whatever chairs in front of that door. Creates a barrier. That's it. What we want to do in a lockdown. The evacuation, you're evacuating the school and you're going at least 500 yards away from the school, 500 feet, or another location has already been pre-designated, depending on weather conditions and the incident at hand. That's it. It's taking care of those charges. Bus drivers have the same kinds of issues that we drill and we train with, depending on the situation at hand. Okay? So when we talk about evacuation, lockdown, shelter in place is really lockdown, but it's business as usual. Typically what happens here is you have an incident outside the school or within the area, and law enforcement is advised until they can secure whatever that issue is, go shelter in place. Shelter in place is business as usual, but all your doors are locked so there's no entry to the school and no one can leave until the situation outside has been neutralized. It's less of disruption throughout the day or a period of time when we're in that shelter in place. We had an incident a couple of weeks ago where we had someone rob the Dairy Queen about 2 blocks away from one of our elementary schools. The K-9 unit picked up the scent of the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, heading towards the school area. So the school went into immediate lockdown. I happened to be a block and a half away at the time when I got the call, so I went to the school. And once the police had set up a perimeter, they were searching the neighborhoods, but they had a perimeter on the school. We took it off lockdown, moved it to a shelter in place. We had about 2.5 hours left in the school day. I think the last thing we want to do is keep people huddled up for 2.5 hours when the threat was not in the school. It was not necessarily the immediate vicinity of that school. Moving to shelter in place, went back to operating as normal. Okay? Severe weather, we know, and hold in place is something, some of you might have this, but we have situations where we have medically fragile children, students in our school. Also, some staff might have a medical condition. And so what we do in that case, we do a hold in place, and it's very similar to shelter in place. We continue to operate. We just hold any passing periods, or students are in the gymnasium or cafeteria, we hold them in place. Or let's say, because we've had incidents where we had a staff person that has gone down, a cook that happened to go down, or a food server, I should say, that went down with a medical condition. We evacuated that site, held the students in place. Away from there allows emergency response to come in, provide first aid or immediate medical attention, and then transport the victim away. Protects the person, protects students from seeing that and actually getting in the way of that, and then we go back to normal operations. So school-safe conditions are intended to limit the person's ability to try to think of multiple things to do when all hell breaks loose. Okay? I'm going to real quickly go through this, as partly because this was the thing I talked about. Communication is the foundation of any crisis, planning, implementation, management, recovery effort. If we're not communicating to our key stakeholders, to our public, what we do is we run the risk of an organization that's perceived to be not knowing what it's doing and what it can do. And let me tell you, if that is the case, and we work with districts where that has occurred, it takes a very long time to rebuild the trust for that public school system, or even a college university. As bad as Columbine was, the fact that we were responding and providing information and sharing information on a daily basis helped to mitigate the bad feelings that some in the community had around what happened. Ultimately, it led to tremendous support for not only the school community, and the school district at large. And I happened to live in the Columbine community at the time, and actually my entire time out in Colorado. So I had an opportunity to see how the community was able to respond from really being traumatized to coming together for the school and the students. We talk about best time of letting students and staff and parents know what to do in an emergency is often before it happens. There's been incidents where schools have not communicated to their parents about what to do in the event of emergency, or what does a lockdown mean. If you go back to your schools and ask your leadership shortly after that, days after the Sandy Hook shooting, how often their school phones lit up. They lit up like Christmas tree because parents were calling schools and school districts across the country, or within their community, you should say, what were you doing? Could this happen? And because we take these kinds of high-profile incidents and we personalize them, especially for us as parents with kids, regardless of what grade level they're in. It just so happens that Sandy Hook Elementary School was some of our most vulnerable victims. It was the first elementary school that had been attacked that resulted in that many deaths. and significant damage. We have so many tools at our disposal for communicating today that we even more so today than we did 15 years ago. And one of the things that we talk about, the reason why it's important to communicate, because the lack of information and the short decision time we have to release information creates uncertainty. So the public is motivated to find out or to reduce that certainty. So what do? They get on the Twitter and Facebook and all these other social media things where they get the neighborhood fence conversations, your diners, your coffee shops. That's where all the information starts to flow. And if we don't control that information, uncertainty leads to increased information seeking, and then we've got a whole big mess because a whole lot of rumors get started and information that we now have to play catch up to. One of the things I often tell school leaders in a crisis, you can never get in front of it. It by nature is reactive. When an incident happens, the best you can hope for is to stay even with it. The longer you delay in response, the longer you delay in communicating your response and what you're doing, the further you get behind that 8 ball, and then you're playing catch up. The only thing we can do reactively as a planning, having plans in place and those drills and those kinds of barriers we put up to ensure that our students and staff are safe. That's the only thing we can do reactively before it happens, those mitigating efforts. And why is it so important? Because people remember a crisis, how it was handled, more so than the details of the crisis itself. Long-term damage to the organization is done before and after crisis than during it, because most communities are in shock. Most schools are in shock. But once they have a chance to assess it before leading into it, in other words, how prepared were we? How much information did we have to know what the school would do in a crisis? And then after, what did they do? How did they help us? How did they communicate to us? Do we feel like we got enough information? Were we able to reunify with our child in a safe location? And was the school district there with either their resources or had connected us with community resources to assist us through that crisis? Even though the news media has changed dramatically as well over the last 10, 15 years, they still set community, national, and world agendas. And so we still have to deal with media because it still has significant long-term impact on public perception. And so we treat our media like watchdogs. They're not our lapdogs. And we've got a friend, we're friends with them. We share information with them just like we share with our public. Okay? Talked about social media networks. It's radically changed the way, not only how we discover what consumers share information, and the expectation of how school districts are sharing that information. So school districts that have Twitter accounts and Facebook pages is critical because we can share information to a larger group in a far more timely fashion than we did in the past. I won't go through much detail about this, other than to say that our public is embracing those new technologies. Schools must do the same as well. I know there's tremendous fear about school districts that are afraid to go into the social media world because they think the only thing that there is porn, smut, and bad language. But in reality, our public is embracing those new technologies. We need to as well. It is a critical communication to our community. All right, I'm going to wrap up here with some perspectives on lessons learned in preparation. As I said, I've been spelling it right. Starting off behind leaves you behind. When we talk about trying to stay in front of being proactive, it's all of that training, all of the drilling, all of those plans in place and those mitigation pieces that we have to be prepared. Because once the crisis occurs, now our best hope is to try and stay even with it. Establish interagency protocols in advance. And not only when I talk about interagency protocols with law enforcement and fire and EMS, ambulance services, knowing what they will do, where to go, how they respond. It's also within organization. So the school district and our transportation department, school district and our special education department, our school district, you can see all of the importance of having those various groups in place. All of those folks are ultimately on our district emergency response team, and we also have them as part of our severe weather team that assesses severe weather before it hits, how we process that information, and the decision making that goes into that. Those are what I mean by interagency protocols. During the crisis, understand it's not business as usual. In many cases, you have a school district, you have to respond, you have to go on, because in Bloomington's case, let's say we have an incident at one school, we have 16 other school sites that this is business as usual. I often talk with school districts that when you think of a crisis at a school, you take a calm pond, and you throw a rock in that pond, you have the epicenter as your crisis. That's where the incident has occurred. You have these concentric circles then, that further they go out, the less of the impact it is. So those schools closest to the school of crisis, there may be siblings. So you may have an incident at a high school, their siblings in the middle school and the elementary school are going to be impacted, maybe not as to the degree of the high school, but will be impacted less so than the schools further out. It works the same way when you look at these high-profile incidents like Sandy Hook. Now, we were a long way away from that, but we felt the reverberations because parents saw the news, saw the information, saw the, started to hear how many students were killed. They connected to that with, especially our elementary school parents, and so they were more impacted than our secondary school parents. Even though we got some calls, it was by and large our elementary school parents. We're 1,000+ miles away from that. But as I talked to my colleagues closer to that, to Sandy Hook, closer to Newtown, Connecticut, they felt it even greater. And so part of this is understanding that it's not business as usual, and sometimes there's a shelf life into the response to get us back to a new sense of normalcy. The other big one here is act in the short term, think in the long term. As I said, every crisis has a uniqueness about it. No two crises are the same, even though a bus accident is a bus accident, but there's no two that are the same. Acting in the short term is knowing what to do and putting those protocols into place. Thinking long term is what are the impact on the students, on the staff, on parents, and the community at large, depending on the magnitude of the crisis, the magnitude of the situation. Long term is also what did we learn? I talked about a hot wash or debrief. What did we learn? What would we do differently the next time? A lot of my training with school districts, we do tabletop scenarios. I'll come in and talk a little bit, and then we divide it into groups, and we have actual scenarios where we do tabletop scenarios. Now, there are some school districts that like to do these very flashy active shooter drills or drills where there's lots of law enforcement coming in or fire, and it makes for great TV, makes for great pictures. But in reality, working with college and universities' human subject review boards, which look at all the types of research they do, the best training is tabletop scenarios. Having your group sit around, take a scenario and say, what would we do with this kind of scenario? So take transportation, for example. You have a crisis, and it's best to do this with mixed groups. So you do it with a school. And the school, you understand how the school is responding, and they understand what your role as in the support of that. But now take it from the perspective, let's say you have a bus accident or an incident. You're now the epicenter of the crisis. What are you going to do? And then what are the roles and responsibilities of others that are to assist you? If you're transporting students specifically to one school, that principal, his or her emergency response team, now plays a critical role in supporting the crisis that is at your bus or the location and so on and so forth. So act in the short term, think in the long term. View the crisis from outside in to gauge the public's and your public opinion and stakeholders' response. So it's just like when we're sort of crisis junkies, those of us in emergency management, we look at every one of these crises from the outside in and say, okay, from our perspective, what do we see? How do we see it? Because we look at it differently than if it's happening to us. So when we deal with the crisis, we now have the ability to say, how will our parents respond? How will our community at large respond? They start thinking of it in that perspective, and how we respond is that viewing that crisis from outside in gauges what we can probably expect from our parents and others. And then because of that, we've learned so much more today and can respond in different ways. We are constantly looking at ways to improve and do better on all of our response. Okay? In the aftermath, know that crisis has a long-term shelf life. Depending on the crisis, depending on the magnitude, if we lose someone, a staff member or a student, it's going to be longer than an injury. that a student or staff member is involved in. Sometimes the magnitude carries over for a period of days. You know, we have a basic tenet in communications, public relations, that you know a crisis occurs, it's going to be on the front page the next day. Our job is to make sure it doesn't get on the front page 2 days, 3 days later. Fortunately, sometimes the magnitude it's on the front page for days and days. In fact, interestingly enough, we had a couple of friends of ours, this was during the Columbine days, friends of ours that worked for the Denver Post, one of two at the time, one of two daily newspapers that covered the tragedy daily. And we had a bet with the reporter that said, when we don't get a call from any news media related to Columbine, we'll go to lunch the next day. That was June 12th, 2000. Nearly 14 months, nearly 15 months after the initial incident. We dealt with it every single day, news media and others related to that. So remember that crisis has long-term leg. Remember the healing process and triggering events. The healing process, we go through the grief, we go through the anger stages, all of the grieving processes we go through. And as a community of either staff or community of parents and stakeholders, you all will deal with it, okay? Brace for blame is going to come, internally and externally. There's always people out there that are quick to point the finger at someone else. So it's best to put on armor and let that stuff roll off your shoulders, because it's going to be there. If we believe we're going to take every person that's pointing that finger at us, take them on, we're going to lose, and we're going to waste a whole lot of time. Continuously, as I talked about, prove your crisis plan, response and communication, seek opportunities to return to normal, even though after every incident it is a new sense of normalcy, and then take care of yourself and your team. Because responding to a crisis, often we operate on a high level of adrenaline, and then when we go home that night or later that day or sometimes the next day, it'll hit us. So we need to take care of ourselves. We need to be able to process that as well. That's one of the most important things when you're debriefing or these hot washes, is talking to your colleagues about it. Not only what you learned, but how you felt. Some of our debriefing that in the initial days after Columbine was 2 in the morning. The only time we could get our crisis team together. And we were able to process it, and then go and sleep for a couple hours before we had to hit it again. But that was the most cathartic and best way to approach how we deal with it on the team. So finally, what have we learned dealing with any crisis? What we've learned is that it's a leadership test. Our response defines the organization, defines your department, defines who you are, and not only individually, but collectively as a team. Be credible, be transparent, be open and honest about what has happened. You know, as I said, bad stuff happens. As humans, we just want to know what you're going to do about it to fix it. It is a communications test, because our response defines the organization from a perspective that we know what we're doing, even though sometimes we might not. Well, I used to teach a class at many years ago at Disney World, Disney University, and Disney had a saying that it kind of resonated with us: is fake it till you make it. And that wasn't to say that we were doing things because we didn't know what we were doing. It's because sometimes the crisis or how we respond is new and unique to us. So we go back to that cardiac assessment, what is right in the heart and mind in making those decisions. Finally, it's a professional test. Our response defines not only the organization, but it defines who we are as individuals. Okay, so you notice the thread is throughout this. Response is critical to our leadership, communication, and professionally how others view us. With that, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have.
I was curious about, like the aftermath and the communication with returning to normalcy. You see that, I suppose it depends on the crisis and everything, but is there a new normal a lot of times? Do they change up a lot of their policies and procedures after this, or what's your opinion on that?
You know, if we were to change significantly our policies and procedures, then what that tells the public and parents is that it wasn't a good practice in the first place.
Yeah.
So it's best to And that's why when we do tabletop scenarios and we kind of strategize and game plan, if you will, you're looking at crises, what is the best response based on what we know our best practices from others, from what we know in our own community, in our own organization, our own department. What are the best practices? Now, it doesn't mean that we can't learn from that and what we would do differently. And oftentimes, when we've assessed it, what we would do differently is really how we would communicate, and so that we don't forget a group. You know, sometimes our staff is the last group that we communicate or share information to, and yet there are various ambassadors. So I would say that yes, it's always a new normal, and you always want to assess what you're doing, because sometimes your policy, it wasn't your policy or your practice or your protocol, it was how an individual or some people did follow it. And then then you ask the questions, or you look at, was it lack of training? Did we not do a good enough job of preparing staff for it? Did we not do a good enough job of giving them all the kinds of types of incidents you may deal with, or what to do in those kinds of situations? You know, years ago, until I think 2 years ago, when that individual, I think down in Georgia, I know it was one of the states in the South, where someone came on the bus and killed the bus driver and took the students hostage. I mean, we didn't hear about those kinds of events. And now I would venture to say there was many school districts that didn't have, as part of their crisis plan, that kind of an incident. I can guarantee you that most school districts now, if they haven't, they darn well better have a plan in place what that looks like. It's probably what led to here in Bloomington, we have duress buttons on our school buses that allows the bus driver to press the duress button, opens up the channel so dispatch can listen to what's going on if the bus driver is dealing with some situation on the bus. And so it's sending that signal. In some cases, those are new types of features that we've got in place to help drivers and staff in other cases to deal with those kinds of incidents. Other questions?
Rick, how do you keep a organization focused? Because it seems like when the event is over, if in a hot wash doesn't take place, so if the department was not involved in it and should have been, there's no circle back to see how. And now, a few weeks have passed, and everyone's like, okay, it's just business as usual, but yet we have not addressed what if this happened again.
Right, so in any district that has an emergency response plan, there has to be that hot wash piece. You gotta close the loop, and you're right, if you don't close the loop, everyone goes back to business as usual. We've learned nothing, and staff have learned nothing. And I would venture so much to say too, that staff would start to feel either pissed off, or they would sort of hold a grudge as why weren't we communicating to you, or what did we learn? Because I would feel like I'm at a disadvantage then. So it's critical to have that hot wash, and it might be the hot wash is just the leadership team, say in transportation, and the driver or drivers involved in an incident. But from that, then the responsibility is upon that transportation leadership team to communicate to all the drivers. This is what happened. This is what we learned. This is what we're doing. And not necessarily in changes, but this is what we did that worked, guys. This was great stuff. One of the things that I communicated with transportation department, this young boy that was hit by a car, had significant injuries, is to get that information back to the transportation department, not only for the driver, but for everyone. Celebrate the fact that we had a driver that did everything that was expected of her, and it didn't necessarily involve her. She was sort of that secondary piece. She watched it happen, she called 911 immediately, and kept the students on the bus safe, and actually had kept the students on the bus from actually seeing that. That's just great stuff. So we celebrate the fact that we had a staff person that knew what to do, followed those procedures and protocols, and then let others know about that. So a hot wash is absolutely critical. I often put it under that recovery piece that we don't do a good enough job of. Again, because the crisis is over, we all breathe that sigh of relief. We think, okay, we can get back to business as normal. We miss a big point when we do that.
How do you learn from these things and then not change your procedures and protocols? You're saying don't change them because then it looks like it's faulty. But how do you learn something and then not make changes?
If what I'm saying is, if you've done your hot wash and you've learned that there was a mistake made, or we didn't follow a procedure or a protocol is far better if we do things. If we don't change, then then it's a mistake on us. What I'm saying is, it doesn't make sense that if you have an incident and you had a response, unless that response was completely the worst thing you could have done, I believe that school districts, if they don't have those policies and practices identified now, and then you change them all completely afterwards, then that means we didn't do a good enough job of establishing what the initial protocol should be. I don't think that that protocols are foolproof, completely foolproof, but I believe the protocols that are in place, 80, 90, 95% of them, if they're followed, the hot wash is about what is that 5% or 10% that we didn't do right. We are human, and so we could have a protocol established, but how we responded to it is, again, what we learn from that is whether we did it the right way or whether there was a modification to it. So that modification, is it something that we should do, or is it just because this situation was so unique that that's the reason why we did it the way we did it, but the protocol stands as such? In that kind of situation, what I would do is, here's the protocol, but this is what we learned off this incident. And if it's a frequent incident and this is what we learned, then you want to change that protocol. So it's important that you have established protocols in place, but what we learn from it, if it requires us to change it or modify it, let's do so. I think if you're wholesale changing it afterwards, then it wasn't a good protocol in the first place.
So Rick, do you have recommendations for, the disconnect seemed to be in our district that leadership have not gone through the training all at the same time, and probably have a different interpretation of how incident command should be established and when is it established and who's in charge. So the principals always believe that they're the ones that are in charge,
Right.
even if it's a bus-related incident.
Right, and I would tell you, because you guys use a safety consultant who we use, Paul McCullough.
Yep.
And phenomenal resource. One of the things I will tell you that I've learned over the last 2 years when we put in incident command is we still have principals that operate different than what our expectations are. And part of that is changing old habits. Part of it is the understanding that you cannot do what you've done in the past. The world has changed, our schools have changed, and you have to kind of get on board. We don't have 100% buy-in yet. But so each drill that we do, we learn from it. And then, there's an expectation though, the fourth or fifth time we're doing that drill, if you've repeated that error, shame on you, and we're gonna call you on that. We've got to change that. So what you're specifically talking about too is, part of our responsibility as the trainers, as the leaders is, if you have a school bus incident, the school bus incident, if it's not on your school property, you're not the incident commander. If it's on your property, then it's a question of, does the bus driver have the capacity to do that and is trained to? Or is the principal incident command until we have someone from the transportation department that is now on site and takes the lead? We do have those command changes too. We train, we drill when we have principals, they verbally, this is Rick Kaufman, incident command, I've got command of the, and so everyone knows on the radio, the team, I've got command. Let's say our transportation director, Tom Astride, comes on scene now. I have verbally, this is Rick Kaufman, I'm handing over command to Tom Astride, or we call him Ace. Ace is now the incident commander, it's no longer mine. I now am a supporting Ace because it's a school bus incident. So part of that is really the training and drilling over and over. That is a bit harder because there's that gray area in there. Who's in charge and who isn't? And sometimes when we say, okay, principals, you take initial charge, and let's say they're not informed right away and Ace is on site. Now you have a clash of it. I shared with you the incident we had at that elementary school where the robbery was close by. The school principal was gone for the day. She was actually in Chicago at a workshop. So the school secretary was the incident commander. Now she's the backup on the emergency response team. She's on the emergency response team, but she's the backup, or I'm sorry, she's one of the logistics chairs. You saw, I won't put up here, but there was 4 critical areas. She's a chair of one, another leader of one of those. But because the principal was gone and the principal did not provide a designee for that day, the school secretary took command. So when they went in lockdown, she said, this is Michelle Dunbar, I've got command. We are in lockdown. That was brilliant, that she took it upon herself to take command. When I came on board, or when I got to the school, took direction from Michelle, what's going on in the assessment, okay, now I said, Michelle, I will take command because we're gonna move to shelter in place. Let you get back to, because I'm gonna need your help in communicating, pulling together information. So I took command and communicated that, and we went on shelter in place. So, long answer to a very simple question, but the issue is that constant drilling and training. We won't always get it right, but when we know what to do, we're better prepared for it. And incident command is new stuff. Law enforcement and fire, they've been doing it for years and years and years, so it's old hat to them. They know who's in charge on scene and when the commander, and the command may change too. We have an officer, a state trooper here, probably can speak far better to it than I could. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick, very, very much. Appreciate it.
We didn't do introductions at the beginning of the meeting. You guys pretty much know. You guys know. Kayla wanted to know, is there any questions, Thomas? Did they come in? Okay. Any hot topics that you guys want to bring up?
Well, I just want to make an announcement, Kelly from the Department of Education, that there's going to be kind of a road show getting put together. We're going to do a presentation at the Special Ed Directors Forum, at the Winners Conference, and at the School Business Officers. It's what is special ed transportation, and it's a combined presentation from me, our special ed finance people, compliance and assistance, and the Department of Human Services. So we're gonna talk about how it's defined from different agencies and how it kind of first evolves as the IEP and what a district's obligation is. So if you can attend one of the sessions, hopefully that will shed some light, and being a combined presentation is kind of, we're all getting on the same boat or bus with. So
What association with that?
the Minnesota School Business Association, the school, it's a MSBOA, not BOA, but the business managers. And then the winter conference in January, and then there's a special ed directors forum that meets once a month, and we'll be presenting at the December meeting there. So we'll go December, January, and February.
Thank you.
So, and I guess if maybe once we get our final presentation together, I can make it available for people that can attend. So.
Could you make the dates available?
Shoot, I don't have it on me.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll have to get back to you. Are you the person, maybe Amy, I could tell
Or
Amy?
Kayla?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, maybe I could send it to Kayla or Amy, and then she could spread it out to the listserv. Yeah.
Have they, just out of curiosity, has your replacement been?
We're interviewing, and that's about where we're at. The thing is, it's still under, we had some reorganization under school finance, so I'm still kind of under the same supervisor, just in a different position. So I'm still gonna be there to bring this new person on board, and so once they come on, I'll mentor her and then, so hopefully, that's what I want for Christmas, is somebody else to do my old job. That's all I want for Christmas.
That's it. Nothing else.
So, yeah, and then, then of course, we'll start planning these meetings and stuff, so.
Sure. Anybody else have any comments? Dwayne, do you have anything? No, you're-
No,
oh,
no,
you're
just keep little kids or kids with special needs away from seatbelt buckles that they don't put their face.
Yeah.
We gotta take them to the hospital and remove the seatbelt.
Oh my gosh.
That was great. All right, anything else? If we, no other hot copies?
Well, I'll throw one out.
Okay, there we go.
Currently, I have a driver who just texted me and said that she's not gonna do her route anymore because we have a student whose parent treats them every morning with a holistic medication. The smell is strong, and the driver has allergies, right? I've driven this student, I can say, yes, that's true. So I've left messages with the parents, talked with the district, talked with the principal of the school, nothing. So how far do you go with a student or a parent or a family?
Are there other students on board?
Yeah, there are other students on board. And it's no, it is not a special education route, but it's a small bus.
Isn't there like, district policies on smells and?
No, I found out this morning that there are not district policies. Oh, we haven't found them yet,
Okay.
so.
Cause I know like some workplaces won't allow it or they have
And
a
we have it-
procedure on how to,
Yeah, we have it as a policy for our employees,
yeah.
but not
for
for the
the
student.
We have to bring that to.
Okay.
We found that when the drivers ask them to stop, they accelerate,
Right.
they add more food. The driver used to point out how bad it is for the baby, the parents.
This is just a non-communicative.
Social office would help you learn a lot of the case manager before you with a parent, but I had a student that was being treated holistically with an oil. That was really smelly.
Okay.
And she started off putting it on the neck. And I don't know how it came about, because I didn't do it, but, she changed the location of putting the oil onto the feet by someone's suggestion, because you can't smell it so much there and it still works the same. That was under socks.
I'm hoping to communicate with the parents
There's
eventually,
something on the
but
back of the neck.
Yeah.
So you know, this is the back of the neck.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it had the same effect you put on the feet.
thank you.
There you go. Anything else? All right, I'll make a motion that we adjourn at 12:12. Thank you guys all for coming. Have a